We'll wait and give folks a few minutes to get on. Good morning. I can see our participant number moving, so we'll give folks a few more minutes. All right. Good morning. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started, though I see folks still joining, so I may just give it a minute as people are coming in. All right, I think we are slowing now. So I will go ahead and start. Good morning, everybody. Want to start with a thanks to everybody for joining this morning. Want to also let folks know this is being taped. We know finding the right time to do these things is always difficult to do. And we know times work for some, but not for others. And as a part of trying to get it get a time, but make sure others can do it. It is taped so that your colleagues and others, and if you want to come back to it, you can as well. And just wanted to start with a huge thank you for everybody for taking the time to submit the questions, taking the time to be here with us. You know, we are all here because we are engaged and committed to this university, to our mission, and to each other as a community. So just want to start with appreciation for that. In terms of what you do every day, but also for taking the time and being a part of this conversation. And today's conversation is really about two things at its core. And one is, this is a conversation about people as a priority at the university and our investments in people. And second, about engagement and the importance of that engagement as a community. And I'll just say a few words, and then I'm going to turn things over to Bronte and Seth to say a few things, and then Matt's going to moderate questions. And again, thanks to everybody who helped get those questions in so we can get through as many as we possibly can. And I just want to start with this issue of investment and this focus on people, which has been a priority and continues to be a priority for us as a university. And whether that's, you know, the work that we did in COVID to do everything from ensure that, you know, our contract workers' healthcare was paid. You know, as we focus on people, it's about compensation, it's about benefits, it's about our tuition remission, it's about retirement, and it's also about things that make people's lives better. And whether for some, that's how we have considered the hybrid workplace, or for thinking through our term faculty and some of the changes that have been done there in terms of timetables and how that's thought about for folks. And so this is something that is important to us, has continued to be a priority, and we want to spend a little time talking about it today and answering folks' questions about it. And that brings me to engagement, that we've heard that there are a number of questions and that folks were hoping for more communication about a number of issues, and that's what we're doing. And the issue of engagement is one that we want to do and work hard to try and do. Our COVID work, we want to kind of build on the work that we did in COVID in terms of the communication that we did. And that was both about getting input, you know, before we made decisions about how we were going to do certain things, having sessions, hearing from the community about that. And so engagement consists of you know, a wide range of things, and whether that's the listening and hearing people, listening to input, thinking about that input and making sure that that input is incorporated in decisions, hearing decisions and hearing the input, even when we agree and don't agree, because we won't always agree on everything, but having that part of the engagement. And then that also that next step of sometimes explaining the why. Sometimes realize that as we make decisions and that sort of thing, we've gotten the input, we've heard, but then don't do that next step. And that's an important part of engagement and dialogue and conversation and listening as well. So that's a little bit about what today is about as well. So the first thing we're going to do, and want to get to folks' questions because that is a big part of this today. But before we do that, I wanted to ask our panelists to just introduce themselves. I'll go around to make sure that everybody knows who all is on the screen today. And then we'll turn to Bronte to kick us off. Matt, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Bennett. I'm the Chief Communications Officer.
Bronte Burleigh Jones.
Bronte Burleigh Jones, Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer.
Beth.
Hi, everyone. Beth Muha, Assistant Vice President of Human Resources.
Bill.
Good morning. I'm Bill Leogrand. I'm Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, and I've been the Provost Liaison with SEIU Local 500 ever since we negotiated the first adjunct agreement 10 years ago.
Trevina.
Good morning, Trevina Bird, General Counsel, Vice President and Board Secretary.
Seth.
Good morning, Seth Grossman, Vice President of People and External Affairs.
Sarah.
Good morning, Sarah Baldessaro, Chief of Staff.
Fanta.
Good morning, everyone. Fanta, Vice President for Undergraduate Enrollment, Campus Life and Inclusive Excellence.
Peter.
Peter Starr, Provost, and happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Bronte, I'm going to turn things over to you, and Bronte's going to do a little bit of this conversation now, but Bronte has also been planning some larger conversations that I'm just going to do the preview for just a little bit. You may say more, but I just think it's important as we think about a lot of the information and questions and making sure that we're both hearing and sharing information. Bronte is designing some things that we're going to be coming back to the community so that we can have more sessions. And she's working on that, but we're going to do some of that, a little bit of that right now. So I'll turn to you, Bronte.
Thanks, Sylvia, and good morning, everyone. As President Burwell said, the priority in our budget is our people, and the approved FY 23-24 budget reflects that through our increases in both financial aid for our students and increases in our compensation for our faculty and staff. It's important to note that these are two of our largest expenses in the budget. Our financial aid is 22% of the budget, and our compensation and benefits are 45%. So in the FY 23-24 budget, we made significant increases to both our undergraduate and graduate financial aid. The largest increase, however, in the approved budget was in compensation in the form of the investments we made for our faculty and staff. These increases represent the largest increase in overall compensation in 15 years, with a focus on equity, performance, certainty, and flexibility. We're investing $76 million over a 2-year period. So to unpack that for you, included in the strategies that we funded that Seth will talk more about in depth, were the 4% increase to address external conditions and reward performance, a budget allocation to address market-based and internal equity concerns, and that's a multi-year strategy. Funding the increases to DC minimum wage over the 2-year period, funding for new and continued positions in support of our strategic plan, increases to the university's share of healthcare premiums, and expanding the healthcare subsidy for members of our community who fell below a defined salary threshold. When I talk about benefits, I want to be sure that everyone understands that we're talking about both our health and dental, our retirement match, and our tuition benefit. And as Sylvia said earlier, we are in the process of finalizing materials for a series of community discussions that will be coming forward with in the weeks ahead, where we talk about how the budget works and how resources move around the university. And these are going to be interactive, and we're looking forward to engaging with the community. So with that, Seth, I will pass the baton to you.
Before you begin, Seth, sorry, but Bronte, thank you. And I just want to emphasize a word, because I think it is part of the conversation and the dialogue and the hearing for us to hear that we have heard from the community. There was a point where Bronte said multi-year. And I guess why I want to emphasize that point, because I think as part of the conversation and dialogue, and that this is something we know we're taking these steps. We believe these are important steps, but this is a multi-year process that we think about this as a continuation. And I know Seth's going to speak to that. I know, there have been a number of changes in different things, but I think it is important. And why these conversations are important is we continue to hear that I want to make sure that there is a sense that the listening and the hearing, as well as this is not a done, this is a work in progress that we are all continuing together. And that's a very important part of this engagement, is making sure that we're continuing to hear the concerns and have the conversations. So just wanted to emphasize that point, Seth, and now turn to you.
Thanks, Sylvia, and thanks, Bronte. Building on Bronte's overview, I want to dive a little deeper into the specific investment in compensation and benefits we're making, both in the coming year and, as Sylvia and Bronte said, over the coming budget cycle and then beyond. In the course of doing the budget or collective bargaining and other steps, our focus on compensation and benefits has been guided by three key principles. One, as you heard from Sylvia and Bronte, the importance of prioritizing investments in our people. Two, having equity across the different components of our workforce. And three, being responsible stewards of university resources. And we think these principles are reflected in the compensation and benefit enhancements that we've announced over the last several months. In June, we announced an across-the-board external conditions adjustment. We announced the performance-based compensation increase, and we announced the term faculty salary measures as our first steps in our planned investments in our people, both staff and faculty. A couple weeks ago, on September 16th, we announced a set of additional compensation investments that will improve internal and external equity, promote retention, and recognize the contributions of our long-serving staff members. As part of these measures, we are eliminating the lowest two staff pay bands and moving employees in those pay bands up to the next level. This change will be retroactive to July 1st, and the increases in affected employees' paychecks will begin later this fall. We are providing compensation increases to staff members making less than $100,000 a year who have worked full-time at AU for 5, 10, and 15 years to recognize their contributions over their longstanding service. For those who have worked at the university for between 5 and 9 years, they will receive a 1% increase. For those who've worked at AU for between 10 and 14 years, they will receive a 2% increase. And for those who've worked at AU for over 15 years, they will receive a 3% increase. These increases will begin in January. Reflecting or building on Bronte's comments, the university heavily subsidized health insurance for all people who participate in the university's health plans. We are extending the heightened university health insurance subsidy for both individual and family coverage for those making up to $55,000 per year. Previously, the expanded coverage was available only to those making up to $40,000 a year. And this expanded subsidy will also begin in January. The combination of these measures will give approximately 2/3 of our staff, both those in the collective bargaining units and those not, some level of compensation or benefit adjustment in the coming year. These investments and our implementations of the collective bargaining agreements advance our commitments to our people and support our equity goals. They also build on the key benefits that both Bronte and Sylvia mentioned, including the retirement match, our tuition remission program, and the hybrid work modality, which is a really important part of our portfolio of benefits at AU. We have prepared, working with University Communications and Marketing, overview of these measures to put them all in one place in an easily understandable fashion. I believe we're going to follow up to share where you can find those on the AU website. And with that, Matt, I think I'll turn back to you.
Great, thank you. Sylvia, anything else before we turn to questions?
No, I think the only thing I would just say is, as we have all of these conversations, putting them in the context of, who we are as a university. And I think most folks, know we are 92% tuition and fee dependent. And while this is a conversation that involves our faculty and our staff and some students, thank you to the students who joined us today. I know some students signed up for this conversation, and we appreciate your engagement, because it is an important part of the engagement, because we know while we're focusing this conversation on people and that side, there's also the issue and question that our students often raise about affordability. And as an institution that's so dependent in that way, I just think it's important for us, while we're focusing on a piece, and that's the piece today, to recognize that other part of the conversation and welcome our students who are part of the conversation today.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A portion. And Again, as President Burwell said at the outset, thank you to the many people who submitted questions. And so as you can imagine, for those submitted questions, a number of them address similar topics. So we've grouped them together into the themes that we're going to go through now. So you might not hear the exact phrasing that you might have submitted, but our goal is to address as many of these topics broadly as possible. I will call on our panelists as we go through each question. And it's during our discussion, you can put questions in the Q&A feature. And if we have time at the end, we will try to get to one or two of those as well. So the first theme or bucket of questions follows up on Seth's comments on the investments in our people. So Seth, I'm going to come to you for a couple of questions here. First, can you give a little bit more detail on the changes that are being made on the pay bands?
Sure, Matt. So the previous pay bands, pay band 1.1 and 1.2, will cease to exist as of the end of this calendar year. Any employee in either pay band 1.1 or 1.2 will move to pay band 2.1. The minimum rate for those in band 2.1 is $36,960. And staff who are moving to pay band 2.1 and whose pay falls below the minimum will have the pay adjusted to that threshold. And again, the pay band changes will be implemented as of January.
Great, thank you, Seth. The second question, you touched a bit on this in your opening comments, but I think it bears reinforcing because we've got several questions about this, is those timelines for implementation for the various compensation and benefit changes that you went through. If you could reiterate those.
Good, and that's good because I just misspoke. I should have said the pay band changes were as of July. The January months are getting me confused. But anyway, the pay band changes will be retroactive to July 1st, but those increases will be reflected in employees' paychecks beginning later this fall. We're working on implementation and we'll have the exact date soon that we'll be sure to communicate so people are aware. The increases to recognize longevity of service for those making less than $100,000 a year, for those, as I described before, for those who've worked 5, 10, or over 15 years, will begin in January. The expanded health insurance subsidy for employees making up to $55,000 per year will also be begin in January 2023, the upcoming start of the calendar year, which is the usual start of our new benefit year. We know there's a lot of different changes that they're on different calendars, and HR will be working with the relevant unit and Peter and Prita in the Provost's office to provide guidance to managers and supervisors so they can provide the information there, because we know it's a little confusing to track both the effective date and when it will be reflected in people's paycheck. So more to come on that. If I could take one more minute, Matt, on the benefits front, we're completing the renewal of the suite of our benefits that Bronte described before for 2023. I really want to thank the team and the benefits committee for their work and input. There's a lot of pressure on health insurance costs this year, and I think the team did a really excellent job of trying to keep things as affordable as possible and to find reductions in costs for staff and faculty where possible. So we're working to finalize those changes, and we'll have more information about that in the coming weeks.
Great, thank you very much, Seth. I want to turn to our next theme. We received questions about the contract negotiations and what was learned, and we've seen some submitted in the Q&A today, so thank you for those. To address these topics, I want to turn to Sylvia, Trevina, and Bill. Sylvia, if you could kind of first give an overview of the approach and some of the lessons learned. Then Trevina will come to you on a specific questions about the negotiations. And then finally, Bill, I'd like to ask you to review some of our history with the union and the contract negotiations and how we're moving forward.
Matt, thank you. I think, and thanks to those of you asking those questions. I think that the question about lessons learned as we think about it, I think one of the lessons that I think is important is confirmation of the importance of the issue of priority and people. When we look at what we've done and certainly what we did in COVID, whether that was the contract workers' healthcare or the fact that we focused on our employees with the lowest salaries to protect from the furlough days, the retirement, increasing the merit, that focus and the focus on the piece of work, and thanks to those that participated in the term faculty effort that came back with a number of the things that we are now working on and implementing. That focus on people, I think, was confirmed during this whole process. It's something that we have done and will continue to do. And I think that was important and helpful. In a university, there are many, many things that resources can go towards. And so I think that that was an important lesson. I think a second important lesson is this issue of communication and engagement, and making sure that we are doing our best. And that's part of why we're doing what we're doing today, to make sure that we are both listening and ensuring that we are communicating in terms of what we're thinking, the facts around our situation as a university. I see another question in there about the question of tuition dependency, which I did mention, and maybe we can come back to that, Matt, because I don't want to get us off on this topic. But I think that those are two very important lessons, is that where the direction and the importance, the prioritization of that in the budget of those two issues, people and affordability, as well as this issue of the second lesson being really around engagement and communication and how we think about that, including explaining why oftentimes in terms of where we are after listening, getting input, but making sure we do that last step.
Should I jump right on in,
Yes,
Matt?
go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Sylvia. I just wanted to say a few words about the negotiations process and how we prepare for that, especially as it relates to retaining outside counsel. So as you all know, we have a legal team that's in-house that works very closely with other folks throughout the university on supporting this process. And the outside counsel that's retained by AU, actually the individual that we brought in back in 2020 to support the negotiations, was vetted and assessed as an individual. So it wasn't about the law firm at all. It was about who is the person who is highly experienced in labor relations. That's requirement number one. Who understands the university, understands it's a very unique kind of workplace and has a respect for higher education. That's number two. And then the last thing, which in some ways it's just as important as all the other issues, is who has the right temperament to engage with the union and members of the bargaining teams respectfully. That is critically important. And at this time, our counsel that we hired was working for one firm. And in the meantime, earlier this year, as a matter of fact, while we were in the middle of negotiations, he changed jobs and moved to a different firm. This sort of thing happens all the time. A lot of our cases, we have to manage those kinds of transitions. And it's usually not an issue so long as it's not disruptive of the process and us dealing with our different cases. So this was a routine thing. And in the months ahead, the university's in-house legal team, the folks who are in my office, will support the implementation of the collective bargaining agreements. Now that we're in the process of completing this stage, we're going to be moving into the next phase of making sure everything is happening and operational on the ground. And then later, when we start preparing for the next round of negotiations, then our outside counsel, whoever that will be, will continue to engage appropriately and respectfully with the union. That is a key part of our standards. And any external partners that work with the university must meet those important requirements as they reflect the university's core values. So that has always been the case, and it will continue to be the case.
Great. Thank you, Trevina. Bill, let me come to you. And you started in your introduction about your history with AU's engagement on collective bargaining agreements. So if you could talk a little bit about that and then some next steps. You're muted there, Bill.
As I'm sure a lot of you know, we've had a long relationship with SEIU Local 500. First, when the adjunct faculty voted to be represented, then subsequent to that, graduate student employees, and then more recently, the provost and enrollment division staff. We also this year negotiated an agreement with the WAMU content providing staff who are represented by SAG-AFTRA. So this year, we were negotiating 4 different collective bargaining agreements. 2 of them brand new agreements, the one with the provost and enrollment division staff and WAMU. So first contracts normally take more than a year to complete because you have to cover all the terms and conditions of employment. So I know some people were concerned about how long it took to negotiate these agreements, but there's really nothing unusual in that. We completed an agreement with SAG-AFTRA in late spring after negotiations that were actually very collaborative and produced a good agreement for both parties. So for the past decade, really, through 6 prior collective bargaining agreements with the adjunct bargaining unit and the graduate student employee bargaining unit, we have had a very collegial and collaborative relationship with SEIU. And that's the spirit with which we approached the negotiations with the new staff bargaining unit. We were able to reach an agreement with the graduate student employees over the summer. But as you all know, we still had unresolved issues with the staff and the adjunct units as the semester was getting underway. I want to really underscore what Trevina said. We negotiated in good faith through more than 30 bargaining sessions with the staff. And at every stage, we tried to maintain a collegial and respectful approach, even when we had very strong disagreements, which we did. But disagreements is not disrespect. And I think across both sides of the table, there was an effort to maintain that kind of environment. Ultimately, an agreement on both the staff and adjunct contracts was reached, and it was reached through compromise. Both sides showed a willingness to be flexible, and each side made important concessions that enabled us to get to yes. The 2 unions, SEIU and SAG-AFTRA, have ratified all 4 collective bargaining agreements now. I saw a question in the chat about the adjunct agreement. That is a completed agreement. And we've begun the process of implementing them. We think that these are all good agreements, despite the stress that was involved in concluding them, some of them at least. They're part of the investments that we're making in our people that Bronte and Seth and Sylvia have talked about earlier. The contracts address compensation and all the terms of employment for each of these groups. And I hope that you'll take a look at 1-page summaries of these contracts, which are available on www.american.edu/unions. And as soon as we get the agreements all signed and in final form, they'll be up on both our website and the union's website for you to be able to look at if you want to look at them in greater depth. Moving forward, our focus is continuing to invest in our people who are fundamental to our mission, as Sylvia said, and promoting equity within the community. And we're also focused on cooperative relationships with the unions. I think one good example of that effort and one venue in which we can demonstrate that desire is through the labor management committees that we've got with all of these unions, but in particular with the provost and enrollment division staff to try to heal some of the unhappiness that came out of the work stoppage. And I'll stop with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. I want to turn to our next themes of questions that came in, which address our faculty. So Peter, I'm going to come to you and then back to Bill for a third question. For the first one, Peter, can you talk a little bit about the plans that are being implemented around term faculty compensation and our focus on equity there and how some of that is being implemented?
Great. In this budget cycle, we put in place a 2-pronged strategy that actually is reflected in the strategy that we eventually put in place with the staff, the provost staff and post-provost enrollment staff. Namely, we brought up those who are at the lowest end of the pay spectrum among our term faculty. In so doing, we collapsed or shortened or lessened the discrepancy between those who hold terminal degrees and those who do not. And we made a serious, and this is the first time in my knowledge that we've done this at American University, we made a serious effort to bring up the salaries on top of whatever raises may come through raising the floor of those who have been here at 5, 10, or 15 years. So we have done, for example, people who have been, we've raised the floor over 2 years for our term faculty to 67 without a terminal degree and 70 with a terminal degree. So that happens. And then on top of that, if as appropriate, if one makes under the $100,000, excuse me, $100,000, what one would be given $2,000 in addition to merit for having been here for 15 years, and then subsequently less in the first year. Those are already in people's paychecks. Right? So those people will have seen in their paychecks this year. On top of that, I know there's been a bit of a question around the $750 that's on top of that. The $750 on top of that is not a bonus. There was a question that came in about, is the $750 on top of that for compression in year 2 for people who make under $100,000? Is that a bonus? And the answer to that is no. That is also to base. So to base, we are seeing compression jumps for people who are making below the threshold. We are seeing jumps for in the first year and then again in the second year for people who have been 5, 10, and 15 years here at American University. We've also recently announced plans to revise the term faculty reappointment process, which will bring greater certainty and reduce administrative burden in the whole way in which we reappoint our term colleagues. And let me say, just to go back to what Sylvia said about multi-year, we are aware that there are compression, particularly salary compression issues on our tenure line faculty as well. We have prioritized this in this budget cycle. We have prioritized our staff and we prioritized our term faculty. But I will tell you as provost, I know that Bronte and Sylvia and others, we know that there's some issues around tenure line compensation and particularly compression as well.
Great, thank you, Peter. There was a follow-up question following all the term faculty components that you just went through. With all of those, are there going to be any changes to the pay frequency for term faculty, particularly those who might not have multi-year appointments?
So this is a rabbit hole, but I'll go down it just a little bit. Carolyn Parker of the School of Education chaired a joint task force between my office and the Faculty Senate last year that came with a series of recommendations which we've adopted and are in the process of implementing. The long and the upshot of it is we're going to have, for most of our term faculty, we'll have so 3 one-year contracts will be then reappointed on a 3-year contract, and then we'll be eligible if enrollments warrant for what we call continuing appointments. So they won't have to go through this endless cycle of 5-year reappointment process. They will, in a sense, not be term faculty. That we're going to have to actually think about the language in this because they will have continuing contracts in that sense. The question, I believe, Matt, comes around the 1-year reappointments. And at the moment, our 1-year folks are eligible to keep health insurance over the course of the year by prepaying the 3 months in their last month, but they're now on 9-month contracts. And what we would like to be able to do, but we have a lot of work to do as part of the implementation of the whole continuing appointment process, which will involve changes to the faculty manuals, changes in human resources, conversations with Bronte and her team. We would like to be able to go to 12-month contracts for the people on 1 year. So that is a goal of ours, but we are very, very early in that as well. But I want to sort of stress that people on 1-year contract, on 9-month 1-year contracts at this point still can get, and who are reappointed the following year still can get health insurance over the summer.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. I want to come to our last theme of questions. And Seth, I'm going to come back to you. We've got questions about kind of some of the broader work being done in human resources to support our people and our operations. The first one is, can you talk about the work that we're doing to improve employee retention and address vacancies that we know are in places around the university?
Sure, Matt. So part of the compensation investments that Bronte and I described include funding to address retention and equity issues. And so we are working in a phased approach with individual schools, colleges, and units on those application of those resources. As Sylvia and Bronte emphasized, it is our intention that these efforts will take several years to come to full fruition, but we are working and we've already started to implement them with certain units there to help with retention and other issues. More generally, we're working on the hiring, onboarding, training experience to help improve the experience for our staff. So that's everything from a relaunch and a revamp of the onboarding process that Beth and her team led to working on the goals and reviews process. We're also working in various ways to fill vacancies as quickly as we possibly can. And we are partnering with all the units in across the divisions to try to move that as quickly as possible. The hybrid 2.0 approach that we launched over the summer is also a really critical part of our retention efforts to create, where appropriate and aligned with the university's needs and job functions, additional flexibility and opportunity. And so that is a really important part of the suite of interventions we have adopted. We also recently launched the AU Supervisor Academy after a successful pilot over the summer to train our supervisors in several areas. We've heard from many people and worked with the AU Staff Council on this about how important good supervisors are to an employee's experience. And we've heard from supervisors about the desire to have more training and more tools to help them in their work. So we think that's an important part of retention as well.
Great. Thank you, Seth. And then the last question, will there be further changes to some of the HR processes as the collective bargaining agreements are implemented, and is HR going to be providing guidance around those areas?
Yes, so the collective bargaining agreement implementation process has many elements. As Bill mentioned, doing the first agreement is often the most complex. And now that we have the agreements in place with both the provost and enrollment division staff and the WMU staff, we're working through implementing those, as well as the new elements, the adjunct and grad student agreements. Some processes will remain the same for all elements of the workforce, and some will change for members of the collective bargaining units. As changes are made in specific processes, which will occur in a phased way over the coming months and years, the provost office and HR will be communicating with the relevant department supervisors about implementation, where there are changes, what those implementation involved, and where training is needed, providing that, including those provisions that are applicable to those in the bargaining units. There are also, as we worked on implementing some of the suite of measures I described and Peter and Bill described, there'll be other changes also. And so we'll be in communication. And just to emphasize what Sylvia and Bronte said, these are going to be happening over the course of this year into the next fiscal year and beyond. So we imagine this will be ongoing engagement with supervisors, managers, HR reps, and others to provide support as we make these changes.
Seth, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for answering the submitted questions we've got. Turning just to the live Q&A for a moment, I just want to address a couple of things, and then we'll ask a question from it. We've seen a couple of very specific questions around health insurance and a couple of compensation questions. We'll make sure those get forwarded to the appropriate teams who can address those very specific questions, who might not be on this meeting today. So we will follow up on those. We've seen obviously a number of questions about the negotiations. I think we covered a lot of that in that pre-submitted question. And if there are follow-ups there, we can certainly look at those as well. And Sylvia, I did want to come back to you on the question we saw about tuition dependence and how we're thinking long-term about the university's finances.
Well, I think this question, thank you to whomever asked it, because I think this question is actually quite important to understanding the context for all of these conversations in terms of our ability to move more quickly than our ability to move quickly or not. Because as you can see, in terms of the world we live in, any changes we do, our people costs and our financial aid are our two largest costs. And so anything we were doing on the people front redounds to our students. And as part of the strategy, so I'm glad folks asked that, because that is actually a fundamental basis of the strategy, Change Makers for a Changing World. And a big part of the strategy is to move us to less tuition dependency so that we have more degrees of freedom with regard to how we think about changes that we're doing. In the strategy, there are a number of core elements. First, I would focus on research, and Diana Burleigh and Peter and the deans and the faculty are doing incredible work, and they are doubling the amount of externally funded research. Remember that when one gets that externally funded research, what that means for the university in terms of replacement, in other words, substituting for the money that is tuition, either comes in the form of indirects, which are often very limited. Indirects are when they pay you amounts to do the work. But for us, because we don't do as much, our science grants get that, and that's terrific, and we are growing that part. But we have a lot of social sciences here at American University, and it's different. So it's not dollar for dollar when you see those numbers. Having said that, we're working. We've doubled it. Thank you to the incredible faculty, many of whom are on this, who are having their work recognized and supported in that way. It's important for us economically, it is important reputationally, and it supports our faculty in the great research that they're doing, or creative product in some cases as well. Another element in terms of moving the tuition dependency is the area of the campaign. And I think there was a lot of confusion about the campaign and some of the conversations that were occurring. Our campaign is a $500 million campaign, but as people give that money, what's important to note is much of that money is in something called bequest, which means you get the money when the person passes, when our alum or the person giving passes. So it's not dollars today. And when people do give the money, they give it in a targeted fashion. And we've tried to make that transparent and clear. Courtney and her team continue to talk about the areas that we're focused on and where that money is coming in, but the donor decides where that money comes. And the third, and probably the most important thing, is those dollars that go to endowment are 5 cents on the dollar. That's how over time, endowment is how over time we shift. And that means that when the dollar comes in, what you do is you spend the money that you earn. And so that is the second way. The third way, as we think through this issue of becoming less tuition and fee dependent, I would just say less traditionally tuition and fee dependent. And a lot of the work that is in the lifelong learning part of our strategy that includes everything from the great work that SPA does on the key executive education program to much of the incredible work on online learning. But many of you who do the online learning know that our partners take a very large percentage of those revenues when they come in. So why I wanted to, I think it's a really important question because it is very related to our ability to move on the issues that we are discussing. And it, I think, also reflects the different pieces and parts of the university. So I hope that's helpful in terms of those are the areas we're continuing to focus on. The other thing, as folks think about important issues like retention, in terms of important issues that help the university in so many ways, most importantly, as we work against mission, the mission on the learning side versus the research side, which I just spoke of.
Great. Thank you very much, Sylvia. We are coming to the end of our time. There was one more question about the recording. And yes, as we mentioned at the top, the session is going to be recorded and posted on the website, and we will make sure that link comes around. We are seeing a couple of other questions about budgetary issues. And just as a reminder to what Sylvia and Bronte talked about, those sessions will be coming up later on this fall, where there'll be more opportunities to engage on some specifics around the budget and the key areas, and also how we think about the future of the budget, some of the things that Sylvia just went through. And again, we are seeing some very specific questions about compensation for different groups or different offices. And as I said, we will forward those on to the right people and make sure we can address those going forward in different formats. So with that, Sylvia, let me turn it to you for some closing comments.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks to everybody who has joined us today. And I think while we aren't going to be able to answer everything and do all the questions, as Matt said, we're going to try and work to address a number of those in other ways. We appreciate folks coming and engaging in this conversation and dialogue. As I said, the questions are helpful and important input too. as we think about and as we go forward with next steps. Some of those next steps Matt just said in terms of some of the sessions that Bronte is going to be doing are continuing ways that we're going to continue in terms of that input and engagement. Know that Peter is working with the Faculty Senate on areas there where we can continue to do that as well. So hope that it was helpful to many of the folks in terms of the information. And I know that it was helpful to us. And so just want to say thank you and close where I began, both with appreciation for the commitment, because I know everyone who is on here is committed to this university and committed to the mission and what we're doing in terms of our critical elements, and that the strategy is structured on. And that's learning, and the learning and teaching part with our students, the scholarship and research and creative product, and then community. And I think it's important to end with that note, because it is what we consider a core pillar of what we do, is the idea of community. And as we often say, it is both a means and an end. And understanding that it is not always easy, or we don't always all agree. But when we come to the table thinking the best and working together on that core mission, which I know everyone who is part of this today is doing. So thank you and appreciate you joining.